Hello everyone, I'm Bruce Bardsley. I'm an intern energy analyst at Regen, and I've been having a look into the balancing mechanism and this dispatch data, which has been released by the ESO recently. So today I'm going to talk a bit about this data, the context it sits in, how the balancing mechanism works, and then describe what I've done with it. So what insight I was able to get from it, some issues I had along the way with integrating it with existing data sets. And then the focus is on the level of transparency that this data provides. So we'll see that it has two stages of classification where some rationale is given for decisions in the control room, but that there is definitely a limit to transparency. And this is what I'll summarize with. So, the balancing mechanism, what is it? It's a vital part of operating the grid because at any point in time, supply must equal demand on the electricity grid. And so, within the control room, they divide the day into half-hour settlement periods, and electricity is traded from years ahead of real time through forward markets to intraday markets, right up until gate closure. And this point is 1 hour before the start of the subsequent settlement period. So all trading ceases and the balancing mechanism takes over, and it's responsible for ensuring supply equals demand within that subsequent settlement period. So there are various assets operating on the balancing mechanism. They can be gas turbines, coal, hydro, wind, but each asset will be submitting to the control room its final physical notification, and this will inform the control room of its position over the next settlement period. So will it be increasing, decreasing, or keeping the same level of generation over the next half hour? And along with that, it will also submit bid offer data. So a bid is a price it would pay per megawatt hour to reduce its generation. So I will turn down, and I will pay for this energy which I'll be saving. And offer, a price it would take per megawatt hour to increase generation. So I will turn up to meet this requirement, but it'll cost you this much. So based on this, and then a number of other factors which I'll get into, the control room will then decide which asset to dispatch to balance supply and demand. That's the balancing mechanism in a nutshell. But now more on where the balancing mechanism, where this dispatch data sits in a wider context. So the electricity grid is undergoing transformation, fundamental transformation, and it must come to rely on low carbon technologies to balance a high renewables supply. So electricity storage assets, batteries, the provision of low carbon flexibility must become dominant. And so transparency of decision making within the control room has been a key request from electricity storage assets who are in this market, and they want confidence that the markets are functioning correctly and that they are competing on a level playing field with traditional, say, gas plants who are balancing. So National Grid ESO have committed to improve transparency of operational decision making across their entire operation and every market, not just the balancing mechanism. And so they want, in doing so, to improve confidence in these markets, encourage new entrants, so get more people involved in providing flexibility and electricity storage, which is needed, boosting competition, and so ultimately reducing the costs of balancing. So as we've seen, costs of balancing have soared as highly variable renewables generations grow. And so again, the release of this data is part of a wider effort to improve transparency. And this data describes which assets are dispatched on the balancing mechanism, when and why, and it's justifying these decisions. And in some cases, it's giving some potential alternative actions which could have been taken. And so I've had a look at this data. I've taken a period from the 31st of March to the 6th of June, roughly 2 months, and I've had a look to see what I can find out. The first thing I did was integrate it with the balancing mechanism unit register, which is a data set provided by Alexon, listing every asset operating on the balancing mechanism. And so important to Regen and ESN has been the type of asset, the location, the fuel type. So steps were taken by the ESO to make this integration possible, which is good. They're using the same unit identifiers. However, there is inconsistencies in some cases which are a hindrance, but again, all possible, so that's a good step. I did encounter some issues on this register, however. There are 5,000 units on there, but only 234 are actually active in the dispatch data, suggesting it's out of date. And then perhaps more of a problem, there are very few assets being dispatched which are not present on the register. Again, this is only a small problem though. And then GSP group, grid supply group, serves as the only locational data. So not only is this not very granular, but it means that assets on the transmission grid have no location data. And this is a big hole because we'll see that assets on the transmission grid are dominant. They make up 77% of all dispatches. In addition, only transmission connected units have fuel type data. So you have another hole, slightly smaller one, in fuel type data. So from the outset, if you're using the Alexon balancing mechanism unit register to get insight into this dispatch data, you have some holes, and readily available high quality BMU data is needed to improve transparency and confidence. But despite this, it's true that you can see some trends in the balancing mechanism and get an idea of what's happening. So over this 2-month period, 85,000 dispatches were made, 36,000 for more bids, 43,000 of them were offers. And here we have the gross volume of energy traded on the balancing mechanism by asset type. So you have those assets on the transmission grid, which are accounting for the majority of volume being traded on the balancing mechanism. And this is that slice for which we have technology data, but no location data. And then you have embedded units, accounting for the smaller section of energy traded. And this is the group for which you have location data, but no technology data. And then you have a far smaller portion of secondary units, or virtual lead party units. And so for that large section where we do have technology data, if we take a look at that, you can see that the balancing mechanism is dominated by gas turbines, and they provide 85% of balancing mechanism energy volume over that 2-month period. In their secondary role, you have hydro being used to boost supply, similarly with coal, and you have wind exclusively being used to curtail supply. So you can see from this bid offer split by technology that wind is only being used for bids, so through curtailment. And this not available section, this is that slice I mentioned before, those units on the distribution level, which we do not have any fuel type data for. So this could be batteries, demand side response, but you can't say from this data alone. So again, identifying the limitations with the data set. Moving on to look at the methodology of this data. So how is it classifying, justifying actions? You have two stages. So the first is a data set of every single bid offer acceptance, also called a BOA, or an action or a dispatch, every single action. And so you have 10% of these being given a system flag, and this is a justification saying it was dispatched to meet not only that energy requirement, but also some engineering or system management requirement. Now this could be maintaining operational limits in voltage, and inertia, or indeed thermal voltage, thermal limits. You have 50% of actions being given an energy flag, but this means it was dispatched not only to meet the energy requirement, but also to meet the energy needs of the asset. So an example is assets will have minimum 0 and minimum non-zero times, so they cannot be dispatched and cut off in quick succession, for instance. So you are catering to the needs of the asset. And so significantly, this is half of all dispatches. If you're not given a system or an energy flag, you may just be the cheapest asset. So that is your reason for dispatch. And this is 26% of actions. And these are called merit order dispatches. And then you have the rest of them. So these are not given a system or an energy flag, and they have cheaper alternatives available, but they were not dispatched. But they were dispatched, sorry. So in these cases, it's worth an extra look, and so they are passed on to a second stage of classification, which we'll come on to. But first, the main takeaway from this stage 1 classification, looking at transparency. So you have a limit in that you have these energy flags, which are applying to about half of all dispatches, and this excludes them from any comparison with potential alternatives, which we see in the stage 2 data. So that is a main takeaway from this. Just briefly on merit order decisions, so that's around 25 to 30% of daily dispatches are unflagged and in merit order, so purely economic decisions. So this is an important metric for participants in the grid. In the mechanism, they want to see the cheapest asset being dispatched as much as possible, a healthy functioning market. So there's large daily variations in this percent of merit order decisions, which would be something interesting to look into, but for another day. Okay, so stage 2 classification. Now this is that 14% of dispatches where we have a comparison with an alternative action. So it wasn't given a system or an energy flag, and it wasn't the cheapest action available, so it's given a second look. And so we have some additional rationale, some extra reason codes which are applied. We have flexibility, so this is a decision which may be easier to change if required. So a flexible asset with a fast ramp up or ramp down rate may be dispatched, but this also works the other way. So a flexible asset may be skipped, which will leave it free to fine tune in shorter timescales. So maybe a bit of a double-edged sword being a flexible asset. We have frequency, a time pressure decision to maintain frequency, less than 5 minutes dispatch and less than 5 minutes duration. Incomplete, so this is where the control room has attempted to combine multiple smaller actions to meet energy volume, but they haven't managed to do this, and so all those actions are skipped. And then we have zonal management. So this is to do with the operation of the control room. There are different desks balancing different zones of the grid, and they operate semi-independently. So importantly, this means that zonal decision making may result in a higher priced asset being dispatched than if a whole national optimization were to take place. And in the methodology document which accompanies this data, the ESO admit that the systems of communication between these two desks, or these multiple desks, can be compromised at busy periods. So I think an important statement there in the methodology. Zonal management is dominant in this stage 2 data set. So remember, this is just a 14% chunk of dispatches, and also that 55% of decisions are allocated multiple reason codes, but we see that zonal management comes into 85% of stage 2 decisions, so by far the most dominant. And also it's the most costly. So if we look here, we have an average cost of a reason code. So because we have an alternative action, we can compare the prices of those two actions, and zonal management is by far the reason with the highest average price difference in offers. So zonal management is responsible for assets on average 106 pounds per megawatt hour cheaper being regularly skipped. So I think a key message there, and perhaps more detail on this zonal management problem would be a good thing to look into. So again, with this 14% of dispatches where we have alternative bid offer data, you can start to look at how often an asset is skipped relative to how often it's being dispatched. And I've defined the skip ratio for each asset. And having looked at this, it's clear that there's a significant difference between those assets on the transmission and embedded. So transmission or embedded level assets, which have lower skip ratios, and secondary or supplier units, which have far higher skip ratios. So a clear difference here. And then, as well as this, I've identified a number of zero dispatch assets. So this list here, assets which are almost all of them secondary or supplier units, denoted by this V or the 2, being skipped but never dispatched. And so the final piece of analysis I did was a look into the frequency distribution of the skip data and the dispatch data. So on the right you have the stage 2 skip data, and on the left you have the stage 1 all dispatch data. So you can see there's a difference. You can see that smaller actions below 30 megawatt hours form a significantly larger proportion of the skip data. And then also you can see that larger volume actions above 90 megawatt hours are almost entirely absent from the skip data. To summarize then, the balancing mechanism must evolve towards zero carbon operation. It sits within this wider context of a changing energy system and the need to decarbonize. And the ESO know this, and they are responding to calls to improve transparency of operational decision making. And so they've released this data, and it's a significant achievement in itself. So it's grown into a database of over 85,000 dispatches. So you can say it's comprehensive, and it's being updated regularly. So definitely a good effort. However, upon looking at it and trying to integrate it with the balancing mechanism unit register to get insight, I came across some problems, some holes in the data. And so Improved transparency would be provided by access to higher quality balancing mechanism unit data, which hopefully could be provided by the ESO. Despite these holes, these difficulties I encountered, it's clear that that trends emerge. You can see that the balancing mechanism is dominated by transmission level assets, specifically gas, which provide for 85% of balancing energy over that 2-month period. And then on to the methodology. It's offering an insight into a limited subsection of dispatches. We saw that system and energy flags are justifying 60% of dispatches. And this is where the transparency ends. For only 14% of data do we have any kind of comparison with an action, an alternative action which could have been taken. And so, I mean, a main point of this talk is this. The degree of transparency is certainly limited. But for this 14% of data, where we have an alternative comparison, we saw that the reason code zonal management is dominant, and it's expensive relative to other reason codes, so perhaps warrants another look. We saw that transmission and embedded units have higher skip ratios than secondary or supply units. And then we saw that smaller actions, less than 30 megawatt hours, are dominant in the skip data compared to the dispatch data. And large actions above 90 megawatt hours are almost entirely absent from the skip data. So it's a window into how assets are dispatched, the preference perhaps for larger volume actions. So that's all for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. But have a nice day.